book on Calcutta, called Calcutta, 2 Years in the City. We then have Mohsin Hamid, who I think needs no introduction to Lahore or Lahoris. He's of course from Lahore. He's again a highly acclaimed writer of fiction, 3 novels, Moth Smoke, set in Lahore, Reluctant Fundamentalist, set both in Lahore and the US, but essentially Lahore. It is imbued with the spirit of Lahore. And then How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, which was deliberately devoid of time and place, but as he confessed, I think it was yesterday or was it the day before, it is really about Lahore. He's also a columnist, an opinion writer, and he's recently started dabbling in science fiction. So we're looking forward to what he has in store for us later. And last but not least, we have Raza Rumi, whom I have known for several years, both as a friend and a colleague. He's from Pakistan, he's from Lahore, but he's an ardent admirer of Delhi. And he has written an extremely personal and personable account of his encounter with Delhi, a book called Delhi by Heart, published just last year. He's also the Executive Director of Justice Network Pakistan. He's also the Director of Programs at the Jinnah Institute. He's a development specialist, specializing in governance. He's had the good fortune or misfortune of having worked with the Asian Development Bank for several years, where we met and became friends. And so I'm really honored to have these 4 panelists. And the title, Imagining Cities, City in South Asian Literature. We've got fiction writers, we've got non-fiction. Basically, what is it that we're talking about, imagining cities? It's not sort of imaginary cities or invisible cities the way Calvino kind of portrayed them. We're talking about real cities, cities that have life, cities that are living, breathing, dynamic. City almost as a character, or the city as a metaphor for our lives today. Are we talking about the fantastical? Are we talking about the real? What is it that we're talking about when we write about cities in novels? That's what I would like to sort of think to myself as what we hope to be discussing. I'll leave that to the panelists to do that. I'm not sure how exactly we should begin, but perhaps we can start with Anis, because I have a very specific question for him. His novel, The World in My Hands, is clearly set in Dhaka in Bangladesh, but he never mentions it as Dhaka. He has changed the names of both the city and the country. So it's an imaginary country called Pandua. It's a city called Palitpur, and so on and so forth. But being familiar with Dhaka myself, I knew it was Dhaka. So just to start, why did you choose to do that, and what role does Dhaka play in your fiction?
Dhaka is very central to my fiction. In my collection of stories, which are 9 stories that trace the evolution of Dhaka from a small town in 1970 to the kind of dysfunctional megacity it is today. And in that, I named Dhaka by name. This novel is very political. It's about the state of emergency that happened in Bangladesh in 2007-8. It's based on that. And I felt that as a writer, I have probably more so than my peers, I've always felt very inhibited by writing about not just the political, but also especially the personal. I think what's held back my writing for the longest time was this fear of, oh, this will offend my dad, this will offend the intelligence agencies, this will offend so-and-so, this will offend my friends. And when I came to writing about this very sensitive topic, I felt that this thin veil of fiction, of not calling it Dhaka, and then making the fictional nature of fiction explicit was a good device for me psychologically to get past those inhibitions. So that
are very Lahore-centric, and Lahore plays a very central role in the stories. How do you city.
As you were saying that about being Lahore-centric, it's funny because I sometimes think my books are more Lahore-centric than I am. I've only lived in Lahore half my life. I've been out of the city for most of my 20s and most of my 30s. And I've been a Lahore resident again for the last 5 years. But somehow my fiction has been quite tied to this place. My first novel, Moscow, I think I was living in the States, and I just, most of the time I was writing it. But I kind of wanted to write about this Lahore of, just smoking degenerates with whom I had intimate acquaintance. And then the next novel was meant to be my New York book, and it kind of is my New York book, The Fundamentalist, but again it's all told in Lahore, so the events happen in New York, but they're narrated with two people sitting in Lahore. So Lahore sort of forced its way back in, and my third novel, which is the first novel I wrote entirely living in Lahore, the 5 years that I was working on that book. And in that novel, again, Lahore was my template, but I suppose I didn't want to be imprisoned by Lahore in the sense I wanted to be free to not write about Lahore. I didn't really do anything, just talk about Lahore, but I wanted the space to do that. So there's no names. But also, it was, like Anise, it's very interesting, I think, that it was mentioning about how if you change names, you open up a kind of space for yourself. What I did was I had no names in the book. And there were two reasons for that. The first was because I think living in Pakistan, in Lahore, it is, it should be, I'm sure it is, completely apparent to all of us that so much is forbidden in terms of speech. You just can't say a whole bunch of things. And so then the question is, do you want to see a newspaper where things have been, edited out, but still presented to you as though it is an intact newspaper? Or do you want to see a newspaper with giant redacted signs on it? I'd rather see the redacted signs newspaper. I think it's more interesting. So when you take out a name like Pakistan, or a name like Islam, or a name like, a mosque, and you replace it with religion, city, country, in a sense, that's a nod to the fact that we cannot say oftentimes what we'd like to say. But also it's an attempt to kind of find ways of saying things that don't inhabit the stereotypes of those words. So you can talk about religion as religion, or a city as a city, or a place of worship as a place of worship, without bringing the baggage of what that word connotes. So all of those things were, I guess, in a way, how could I write about Lahore for myself? Instead of in the way it's been defined by everybody else. And for me, the easiest route to do that was to not call it Lahore or anything, and just describe things as I saw them, and not let names do the heavy lifting.
Thank you. Amit, your novels are basically set in Calcutta, but then after writing 5 works of fiction, you decided to write a book about Calcutta itself, the city, and your 2 years that you spent there between 2009 and 2011. What made you decide to move from fiction to non-fiction and write about the city as a city? It's a very personal account. It's very much your impressions of what the city was way back in the past, what it has become and what it might become in the future. But it's very much your city. Why the non-fiction?
Because my agent told me to write the book.
I'm sorry?
My literary agent came to me like the muse and said, "Will you write this book?" And I said no, as you often say to your muse. No, 3 of my novels are set in Calcutta. And they kind of, my first novel, A Strange and Sublime Address, my third, Freedom Song, and the fourth, A New World. And they all explore different points in that city's history. In A Strange and Sublime Address, I'm recording various things about my own temperament, which I discovered through Calcutta and recuperating Calcutta to myself. The fact that I didn't want to write about character, that I didn't want to write plot-driven stories. All these are things that in the end I discovered through thinking about what my response to Calcutta had been as a child. It had been a response to do with a certain kind of interior space, the street, coming into that space, encroaching upon that space, digressions, overheard things, glimpsed things that don't add up necessarily to stories. That's what Calcutta gave to me in A Stranger's Sublime Dress. In Freedom Song, I continued down that road, but aware now that that terrain had changed at that time after 20 or whatever years of left front rule, and the city, and especially the country, being on the cusp at that time of the new BJP-led dispensation. Again, a new world was another look at that city from a completely different perspective. Now, in 2005, my agent, while I'm wandering around Wittenberg Platz in Berlin, phones me and says, will you write a non-fiction book about Calcutta? This is shortly after, I think, Sukreta Mehta's Bombay Maximum City had come out. So I knew what was going on in his grey cells. And I said, no, I'd actually much rather write a book about Berlin. Mainly because of the very things I mentioned that interested me in Calcutta, also interested me in Berlin, as a city of not linearity, but of digressions. He wasn't interested in that, and I wasn't interested in Calcutta. After there were reasons for me not wanting to write about Calcutta in non-fiction form. Firstly, I didn't think that the creation myth of the new India, shining India, could be addressed by writing about Calcutta. It could be addressed by writing about Bombay. All the ambivalences of the new India and its effervescence, the new sort of energy that was supposed to inform what had happened to India after economic deregulation. And the breaking down of barriers between high and low, middle class, working class, popular culture, high culture, everything that characterized the world we lived in now, could probably be addressed by writing about Delhi and Bombay, but not, it seemed, about Calcutta, which was still out of sync with that change. So I resisted that. In the end, I thought, let me write about this post-Bhadrolok city, Bhadrolok, the Bengali word for genteel, civilized, civil person, in which I am living now. And wondering to myself, what am I doing here? Looking at the people who are living there now, about whom I too am wondering, what are they doing here? Let me write that story. And that's how this new book began to be written.
Okay, great. And Raza, in your case, you're very much in the world. From what I know of you, and that's been many years. But you decided to write about a city that you were not familiar with, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, you went there for the first time in 2002, is that correct? Yes. Or 2005, as late as that, and then you decided to write this extremely personal and very heartfelt account. In some ways heartrending, because you sort of write about the way Delhi was and what it has become, but you focus on very specific aspects of Delhi. Any reason why you chose to do that? It's a very interesting, detailed book about it. It's really Delhi, but there's Lahore in the background somewhere.
Yes.
All of it. So can you tell us about that?
Well, partly I think being Lahori, Delhi and Lahore have a lot in common. I mean, both in terms of the way they've evolved and the 1,000 years of sort of shared history. So that was the first thing that struck me. But I mean, I didn't want to write about Delhi actually. I wanted to write something else about Dara Shiko's life. And so I met a publisher who showed great interest, and then I wrote a chapter or two, and it was fine. But then I was exploring the city and going through the archives, etc. And I said, well, I think I must write about the place first. And I think it is a personal account because it has to do with our identity as sort of Pakistanis, but Indian Muslim kind of heritage that we have. And if you go down deeper into Delhi's history, then who we are, even as Pakistanis, or I guess to some extent Bangladeshi guys who like that, has a lot to do with how it was constructed, over 8 or 9 centuries of both Muslim rule and amalgamation of various cultures, beliefs, and ideas. So that whole process fascinated me, and I think partition was a bit of a rupture to that growth of a composite culture, but somewhere it exists and survives both in Pakistan and in Delhi as well. So that whole subject fascinated me, and then you get deeper into the cultural sort of mores that we share across South Asia, like the music we enjoy, or the food we eat, or the clothes we wear, or, you name it, even the architectural styles. And so all of that, you find some linkage or origins in the old medieval Delhi. So that, the medieval area, as you rightly said, that was my focus. And also as a Pakistani Muslim, because these are the identity questions we have here. And then you kind of question them as well, and you want to explore them. So the book kind of shaped up.
Yes, I was joking with Raza earlier that actually the subtitles, Sufis, singers, and ruins, because it really does focus on those aspects of Delhi and the shared connection. Now, how do each of you view the role of the city in whatever you write? How do you approach it? Is the city integral to what you're writing? Is it does it form a part of the storyline? Or how do you view the city? In your case, it will be non-fiction, so I'm not sure what you're working on next. But in the case of the fiction writers, perhaps, how do you see the city? It's open to anyone who would like to.
I'd like to respond to that because I think for me, there's this sense of having a literary sensibility, and I hesitate to generalize it to that because it may be a defect unique to me, but I've always felt as a kid, as I was growing up, that everything I read felt more vivid and real to me than what was up there. And I think for a lot of very geeky, readerly, bookish types, that's the case. So for example, to me, love happened in literature before it happened in real life. And I was sad about the death of Prince Andre for days when real relatives who passed away didn't move me in the same way. And, it's a defect. And so Dhaka to me, as I was growing up, there were no books about Dhaka that made it real for me, because it didn't bring up Dhaka. So to me, as a 12-year-old boy or 16-year-old boy in Dhaka, I went around the city. But to me, Tolstoy's Moscow or Balzac's Paris or so many other people's New York or London felt real and present in a way that Dhaka didn't. And all my life I've kind of waited for that book to come through that would make the reality that exists in our minds somewhat more convergent with the reality that I'm encountering. Because so much of writing in Dhaka has been, Dhaka's sort of different from all the other major South Asian cities, because it, on the one hand, is 400 years old, which is not as old as Lahore or Delhi. On the other hand, it's very new. It had a population of 1 million in 1970 and has a population of 12 million now. Even physically, Dhaka, the size of it, only about 1/10 or 1/8 of what existed in 70 it's that much bigger now. So compared to most cities in the world, I believe it's like one of the most newly constructed, newly built cities. And I think it was Kobo Abe who said cities are bounded infinities. In the case of Dhaka, it is both unbounded and infinity. It's, both the city itself is physically growing and is changing. And I felt like the writing we had were sort of, in Bangla, the writing we had were basically sort of watered down mimicries of Calcutta writers writing about Calcutta, but just the place names changed. But it didn't capture that essence of Dhaka, its vibrancy, its vitality, its even a violent streak, a ferociousness, all that was missing. So for me, writing has been all about making the lived reality more real or vivid for me in the way other places have been real for me, if that makes any sense.
Amit, any views of Calcutta?
me saying, he had a problem sort of responding in any emotional way to Dhaka for at least a period of time. I grew up in Bombay, and as I said earlier, it was Calcutta actually that instructed me on what the modern city is. And so, as I said in my answer to the earlier question, it then made me sort of a particular kind of writer, that city. Now, when I say modern city, what do I mean? I suppose what I encountered in Calcutta, let me give a brief context about the Bombay I was growing up in. My father worked in the corporate world. So I grew up mainly in apartments which were on the 12th floor and later in the 25th story. So one of the things that I found in Calcutta were these two-storied houses such as the one my uncle lived in, which gave me access to the street. So the presence, the neighborliness of the street and the presence of neighborhoods is something that I became aware of as a child when I would visit Calcutta, among many other things. But also the paradoxical kind of cohabitation of a kind of vividness along with disrepair, dysfunctionality, decrepitude. And that I quickly became addicted to. And I would sort of seek it out when I went to other cities. So, when I went to America for the first time, my first stop was at San Diego, and it was my first discovery of American suburbia. No one walking on the streets, a very kind of vehicle-centric, a car-centric city. And it was all very pretty, but I couldn't understand why I was so depressed. Then we went to New York, and I suddenly felt the blood flowing within me again. And this is not the packaged New York of today, but the New York of 1979 in economic decline, smelling of piss and petrol fumes. And I thought, it's oxygen to me. These smells are oxygen to me. And that is the addict sniffing out modernity. And it was Calcutta that taught me that. So the other thing, I suppose, is that to me, what is ordinarily called in novels background, and then when you write about background, it's pejoratively called description. That to me is the lifeblood of writing. And I came across a kind of reason for this in an essay about the writer Walter Benjamin by Susan Sontag, called Under the Sign of Saturn. And she's developing on a throwaway remark by Benjamin, who says, I was born under the sign of Saturn, the sign of impediments and delays, that he never finished his projects. And she begins to categorize the kind of what it is that makes up the saturnine or the melancholic temperament. The melancholic temperament is drawn more to objects than to people. I think I must have that, the melancholic temperament somewhere, because of being drawn to, not so much to just to lives, but the setting, what's happening there. And again, I think Calcutta is where I first encountered the truth of the setting most vividly.
So the setting becomes very important.
It's very interesting what you said about the idea of being drawn to objects more than people. I think that I think of cities not so much as objects, but actually as, to me, a city is like a character. Not people in the sense of Lahore is 10 million people, but Lahore is a person, in a sense. And it is like that for me, partly because as a writer, when you create a character, or you represent a character, or you present a character, or you present a city, you do it the same way. You do it by building up these worlds that accumulate to be a kind of portrait or something. And so the object-person distinction, I think, for anybody who creates fiction using words is constantly blurring, because you're using the same thing to build both objects, people. But also, I think that cities, in a sense, are self. What is it? And for me, the human self is that there's a kind of biological machine sitting here, a niece. And when it was turned on, it produced a kind of projection, like an iPhone onto its screen produces a little, thing that has an apple on it. And that thing is his self. And we need to have this thing that our machines produce, the self. But if we think about what the self is, it's just a bunch of stories that we tell ourselves. I was born here, I'm like this, I'm a good person, I'm not a good person, I'm this and that. And so even as individuals, I think ourselves are basically made up of stories. And the relationship to a city that you have is also one that's made up of stories, which can be equally ephemeral, or in some case they can be overarching narratives, which are just as false as the overarching narratives we have about ourselves. So I find that in dealing with the city, it is a, and this is something which I'd love to ask Raza about, because he's had, you were talking about the sort of the Sufi-ness of his Delhi take. But I think there is a almost kind of Sufi quality in the sense that cities allow us to recognize ourselves outside of ourselves, and or at least provide some kind of a mirror to what we're doing within ourselves. And so they're a bit like people, individuals, both in that they feel like people have a relationship with law. It's not a thing that I walk on. It's a place that I miss when I'm away, that I dream about, that I imagine is affecting me, that I imagine that I am in a tiny way affecting back or trying to affect back. And so I think that the city is really interesting, both as a place where this object-person distinction gets completely blurred, and as a place where our individual selfhoods, the story that we tell ourselves, meets this external version of the same thing. So, I mean, I don't want to sound overly new agey about it, but I don't think it's an accident that cities like Lahore are effectively built around shrines of some type. There's some story being commemorated here. You walked in this direction or that direction. There was somebody who did something about whom stories are told, and 1,000 years later we're still living around that place and those stories, and they've become our stories. So for me, the city is very, very fertile and inescapable, and actually really as much a person as anybody else I know.
Mohsin, that's incredibly interesting, and I don't want to talk about myself, but I come from Karachi, and I said earlier as well, city as a character. I personally couldn't agree with you more. I think of Karachi as a character, as a person. And I was born there, I lived there most of my life, and I have seen it change over the years. I get angry at the city. I become happy with the city. I think of the city as a person. That has changed over the years, and I'm not happy with a lot of those changes. I'm very happy with some of the changes, and I respond that way. Now, Raza, your book, Delhi, when I was reading it, I thought exactly the same thing, that he's writing about Delhi as a character. Yeah, it's almost like he's describing a living, breathing person. I mean, did you have the same views?
Yeah, I think, I fully agree. I think it is the way you mentioned Karachi, or what Mohsin said about ancient or old histories, perpetuating and living in the present. But I think on this issue of cities, the idea of belongingness, or what Wataniyat, as Aisha Jalal has also expounded on it in Tate. I mean, that's a very kind of lived reality in South Asia. People often relate to their district, to their village, to their city, and not so much to the identity of a nation state, which are very, very new. Bangladesh being the youngest in Islam, for example. And so often cities acquire that relationship where you start having this relationship. And we have Mr. Grant Neville here from India, who's authored this lovely book in Lahore, and he left in, I think, after partition. And he still has a relationship with Lahore. And so, in my book, I've also captured many people from Delhi, from Lahore, who sort of get together on a regular basis and remember Lahore as it was. But this is not the Lahore that they left. It has completely changed. Even when I came back from Manila in 2008, and I started to live in the Defence Housing Authority, I came after 20 years to Lahore, because I left as a student and then I was just visiting, but I was living in this new sort of suburb of the place I knew, and I felt a stranger. And so ultimately I moved out of that whole cocoon because I just have no personal relationship with that. So I think one common theme which is also, because I've been fortunate to visit Calcutta, Dhaka, and other big places, I think one of the sort of common threads is the way people imagine their belonging or imagine a place as a whole and what it is in real. So if you talk of Delhi, I mean, there's no one Delhi anymore. There are hundreds of them. If you talk of Lahore, I mean, there's a planet out there called Bahria town, 20-30 kilometers away, which is a self-contained urban space in itself, or Karachi with all these outer posts, and in Dhaka, if you go to culture is a totally different world compared to what other parts are. But the imagination of a place is totally personal. It's personalized. It's as Mohsin says, like a human relationship.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to pose another question to all of you, and then I think at some point we'll open it up to the floor for questions. You mentioned the real and the imagined. The question I've had in my mind when reading the works of you writers and several others where the city played an important role, how much of it is real and how much of it is imagined? What you would like the city to be, how you would want the city to be projected, and how much of it is actually the reality. I mean, Raza just articulated on that, and I think that's very important, both when you're writing fiction and non-fiction. Even in the non-fiction, a lot of what you wrote in your book seems to be a longing for something, may not be entirely real, it's your perception of it. And in fiction, of course, it's imagined, so how much of it is real and how much of it is your imagination that is projecting onto the reality?
I think for myself, it's very hard to separate the two. I think it's almost up to readers who know the city well to perhaps distinguish that. But to the extent I'm conscious of having crossed the line one way or the other, in my novel at one point, one of the characters goes to this place where he's supposed to meet a friend for lunch, and the friend hasn't turned up, so he orders a glass of wine. And normally that would never happen in Dhaka because like most of Pakistan, it's a dry city. But speaking of longing, I often wish I could just go wherever I'm going in the city and order a glass of wine if I'm waiting for people. So when my brother read it, he said, people couldn't do this in Dhaka. I said, yeah, but it's not Dhaka, it's Palitpur. So yeah, that was the one deliberate trespass I committed as a gesture, as an advice to the city fathers, as it were, of what would make it more of what in my mind are criteria of real cities and civilized cities.
Like Anis, I'm very confused by this notion of reality and whether such a thing exists. There clearly seems to be something which is imagination. I'm fantasizing all the time or lost in thoughts. But whether there's something that you call reality is much more tricky for me. Yes, there's a chair, I think, I'm sitting on it, etc. But I think reality is a kind of fabrication that we come up with. That, this is a cloud of atoms, it's not a solid object. But I'm relating to it as though it's a solid object. And that is something that I'm doing in every aspect of engaging, because I cannot comprehend what reality is. So I have a series of approximations as a human being to deal with things. As a writer, I think that I think all writers operate at the intersection between reality and imagination, in that, the very act of trying to write something is to take imagination and make it at least physically concrete, or to have it take a form that remains constant in a way that the imagination doesn't. The imagination is always in flux. So there's an attempt to realize imagination. And so because of that feeling that I have, and it may be that I'm just defective, joining Nice on that panel, but because I'm not exactly sure what reality is, how much one needs to trust in the notion of reality, I'm more interested in how the imagined thing that I am doing, which may be talking about Lahore, is rippling inside somebody else who's doing another imagined thing about reading about Lahore. And between us, our imaginations are playing. When our imaginations play and the direction feels congruent, we might say that we're both talking about reality, or at least about a shared dream. When our imaginations are playing and it feels discordant, we might often say, well, you're not talking about the real Lahore, you're talking about some, mythological thing. But I don't, I mean, there's a city here, but I don't really believe Lahore exists, even though I treat it as a character and a person. I think there's 10 million different Lahores walking around in people's heads who live here, for each of the 10 million people, and I probably have more than one in my head. So when you start looking at cities and you start looking at reality and all these things, I think it all begins to blur. And the question for me as a writer, as a human being, is at what point do you want to fix your gaze? Is it the near distance, the middle distance, or the far distance of this blurry thing? But I'm not overly concerned with the fact that a character bought some wine in a city that may or may not be Dhaka. I'm not concerned about the reality of that. The imagining of it is sort of sufficient. Which, I guess the last thing I should say, which doesn't mean that I think that, I can write anything about Lahore and claim it equally. I think that instead it's that, what was the stance of the person who's expressing what they're writing? Is what they're expressing, coming from that stance, sort of concordant with that stance, that makes sense to me in that context? That's what I care about. So if I'm saying Lahore is like this, foreign news correspondent, and I'm trying to communicate to the world, and I'm manipulating what I believe Lahore to be with the intention of creating some political thing, that to me is discordant. But if I'm writing about a feeling in Lahore, what it feels like in Lahore when it is winter time and it is overcast and it is sort of grey and it is awfully melancholic and noirish, then capturing that feeling becomes the central project. Being true to that feeling becomes central project, and whether that is real or not real is not so important, but it can be honest in a sense, even if it isn't real.
Can I sort of, real and unreal, or imagined? Can I bring in a different opposition, maybe related to this? So, I began to write, my first novel was published, I wrote it much earlier, it was eventually published in 1991, which is maybe 10 years after Midnight Streaming was published. So I was working with a certain idea of the novel and what I would write about, gradually becoming aware that this was my backdrop, that of writing large books about, in a sense, historical panoramas, especially the historical panorama of independent India and the creation of independent India. And I knew that I didn't want to do that I was not going to work in that vein. I was going to write, for the want of a better word, although this is misleading, a regional novel or a local novel, or a novel, but not even a novel about locality, but a novel that would not in any way try to become a symbol or metonym of the story of India. I was not interested in India or representing India in my writing. Let me connect this with cities again. Let me again turn to Walter Benjamin, or Benjamin, however you wish to pronounce the name, and to his essay short essay called The Return of the Flaneur, where he puts forth this a very charming and in the end influential idea about a new kind of city loiterer in mid-19th century or late 19th century Paris, where the city makes it possible not just to go around looking at landmarks, as I don't necessarily want to do in Lahore. I mean, I've been told these are the landmarks you can see, but I also want to see the whole city, I want to see the actual city. So not just to go looking at monuments and landmarks, but to look at glimpses of ordinary life, whether we call these objects characters or whatever. And he says this happens in the arcades. The loiterer in this place which is neither outside nor inside these arcades dawdles instead of going to work or even looking at the great historical monuments of the city, and looks at the things people are selling with a kind of incongruous interest. Then he says that this could only have happened in Paris, which is not true. But he says it couldn't have happened in Rome, because Rome is full of historical monuments, and historical monuments are so much junk to the flaneur. This is what he says. So he's making an inversion. Historical monuments are junk to the flaneur, and junk, he mentioned a few, like the weathered tile, a doorknob, are full of history for the flaneur. So history is junk, and junk is history for this new city sensibility. So for me as well, in Calcutta, it's when people come, I take them to see houses in which people live. Some of the interesting houses, because these to me are the landmarks. Calcutta, to me, doesn't have interesting historical landmarks. I feel bored of that kind of tourism, going to Taj Mahal, whatever. It's a wonderful monument, but that's not my idea of what I look for. So, this then plays into what you write. You know, you are not writing about monumental ideas of history. You are in the place where that loiterer is finding that junk to a certain extent is history. And the historical is junk to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think
your book is a lot about monuments.
Yeah, I was thinking of junk monuments.
But you also bemoan the fact that those monuments have turned into junk.
Yeah, that's I think. Well, thanks for giving the cue, because I think that's the other issue I feel. The reason for writing that was my book as well was that the disconnection or the kind of severance from the lived collective heritage. And in Pakistan also, Lahore or other parts, you see this kind of neglect. A lot of people who live in a space have no remembrance or no linkage. I mean, same here, and that's what struck me in Delhi as well, with the kind of nearly 1,000 years of recorded history and all those sort of monuments, and hinting they were almost conquest, etc. But there was this, I mean, we as Pakistanis kind of have an imagination of India or Delhi, when I was growing up, as this sort of evil enemy territory. And so, you would think that there are all these plotters and schemers, the Hindu Banias, out to destroy Pakistan. So when I went in 2005 as a younger person, and obviously, so that stereotype got challenged. That was the first kind of experiential thing that I could record or remember. And then, obviously, there was so much that one had not learned or heard or known about Delhi's past. And a lot of people there I met. I mean, there's a place called Horse Khas, which is located, which is now a sort of arts street or a fashion district of Delhi. But if you ask a lot of people there what is Horse Khas, they have no idea what it is. And it is, I mean, I'm not saying that perhaps that's the junk thing, that's how it was, but there's this disconnection. And I that's what strikes me across the cities in South Asia. Of course, modernity and now, and its sort of discontents are there. And why we're stuck in the past, there's a whole valid argument to be. Alright, if urban spaces are like people and characters, they change, they evolve, etc. But I think the way we have imagined ourselves as nation states, as people, as the identities we've tried to garner, has had that kind of effect, where heritage is something, the least important. In Pakistan, as you know, I mean, even Mohenjo-daro was in the public eye recently because there was this festival being launched here. And, a lot of it was a political reaction as well. But in effect, what it also meant was that nobody had actually thought of these 5,000-year-old ruins that we are sort of inheritors of. And so there's this disconnection in Pakistan. In Pakistan, we have deliberately distanced ourselves from the pre-Islamic heritage, or whatever before 47. You really can't own it, at least from the state level, whether it's Mohenjo-daro, Takshila, Gandhara, or all the sort of infidel symbols, which are sort of Puristan cannot handle. And that sort of revisionism is also creeping in the other, on the other side of the border. So, your memory and your identity then kind of shape your perception of it.
Well, thank you. Mohsin, you said something very interesting, which I think is something worth thinking about, which was the 10 million people of Lahore, probably each one of them views the city differently. And when we talk about old Lahore or old Delhi and the ruins and the monuments and what Ahmed was talking about, the junk versus the historic, people who live in the Purana Shahar, for example, to them, it's not a monument, it's their home. So they don't think of it in terms of a tourist, as a tourist would, they're not coming to look at it every day, this darwaza or that darwaza, and, which was built what. To them it's everyday reality. So it's very different from who's viewing the city and how you're viewing it. As a writer, you're viewing it sort of dispassionately from the outside in a way. Whereas somebody who's living in the city or in those places you're writing about is not really thinking about that. So is there that kind of disconnect as well that we're talking about when you write in your books about a city?
Well, I think that, one of the things about writing is that the point of view from which you are writing needn't be the one that you normally have. What I find is when I'm writing, I discover how fractured my point of view is, because if you're writing, for example, in the first person of somebody who's ostensibly not yourself, whose point of view are you writing from? It's another human being that you're imagining relating to a city, for example. And in Maud's Mode, the way my first novel, it was constructed with a whole series of different people narrating in the first person. And so you effectively start telling different stories about a city. Yet, of course, all the stories have come from within you. They didn't really come from anywhere else. So, were they there already? Did they come into existence because you told them? Is that kind of fractured sense of where the city story comes from? I don't know, but I think that because we sort of are shared inhabitants of cities, and because we walk around with different stories of cities in our heads, there does wind up being this whole multiplicity of stories playing out. And it's significant to us because we each have a kind of sense that there is a story of Lahore. So you might have a different story about your mother, I might have a different story about my mother, but it doesn't matter much to us because they don't need to overlap. But somehow we expect our stories of our cities to find some degree of overlap with each other. And I think what's as a writer, for me, what's very interesting is how that all begins to fall apart, and how cities start to become this congealed sense of lots of different people interacting with this thing.
Thank you. I've been reminded that we need to open it up for questions. There's many more I could ask, but let's open it to the floor. If we can have some lights on the auditorium so we can see who it is that is asking the questions. And please, if you could make your questions and make them very brief, it would be very helpful. We have one gentleman there and then one gentleman in the front over here. First over there, please. Identify yourself and then just proceed.
I'm Ariz, an architect, and my question is specifically to Mohsin. What's the difference between imagining a city, like when you wrote Hot Smoke, when you were in New York? This was a city of nostalgia, and highlighting some of the aspects that you liked well, and in the other way, and then when you wrote this last novel, in Lahore, what's the difference between imagining the city when you're away from it and when you're actually a part of it?
Thank you.
I think that I feel like I carry around Lahore in my head. So when I'm not in Lahore, there's this place in my mind that is living and doing things, and when I'm writing about it, I'm going into that space. When I'm living in Lahore, it's not that different. There's still a city in my mind that I'm writing about. Just being here doesn't magically change that. But the city in my mind keeps bumping up into the city that I see. And so it does different things. It's kind of weird because the outward gaze of looking and wandering around Lahore and living here, and you find unexpected things, but equally in the inward gaze of thinking about the Lahore in my mind, I also find unexpected surprises, which is strange because I should know them in my head, but thinking about Lahore, I often wind up surprised when things pop into my head. So I can't give you a simple answer as to how it's different to be here or there, writing about it. I can only say, I guess, that bumping into the city while writing about it is, well, it's a little bit like sleepwalking. That you're sort of writing about this thing and then you're also in it, and you sometimes find you're thinking, this is really strange. Am I actually on the street which I was just writing about? It's not a very good answer to your question, but it's I guess the best I can manage right now. So.
Yeah, I'm sorry if it sounds like that. I just wonder, how do we celebrate cities along the gender lines? We didn't hear about that. So.
Cities and gender. Along gender lines. Is this, sorry, did I get you right in, you're asking whether the city is male or female, or, okay, right. Do you view the city as male or female? Or in the case of Amit, this sounds and smells.
Sounds and smells, female.
Yes, right, sounds and smells, female, says Amit. Any views on that?
Sure. I think it would have been interesting if we actually did have female panelists as well. Maybe someone like Saba Imtiaz, who's written what promises to be a very humorous book about Karachi. But we have to make do with what we've got here. And in that spirit, what I would say is, people see cities from their own perspective. So, for example, in Dhaka, for a newcomer, a young boy who's come in from the small town or village to city, and who's perhaps not very prosperous, I imagine for him the city is primarily, like as he goes about his day trying to look for a job or something, his biggest challenge, first of all, is that there are no public toilets. He needs to find a good place to pee. And it doesn't exist, the facility. And the transportation is too expensive, so he has to walk extraordinary lengths. And then, he has to wait because he's so unimportant, and, people make him wait for 3 hours, but there's nowhere to wait. So I don't know if anyone here watches this sci-fi show called French, where there are these observers, and whenever I see South Asian cities, I feel like we've actually had these observers land, and by the thousands they stand on our streets observing the city because they have nowhere else to go and wait. By contrast, someone like me, a pampered, privileged elite, etc., My experience of the city is from the air-conditioned cocoon of my car, and I particularly don't worry about where I'm going to be next because I'm headed somewhere where I will have access to a fairly decent facility. So similarly, I think from a gender point of view, from different class points of view, you will have a different perspective on the city. With women, in the case of Dhaka, it's true, and I fear it may be true of other South Asian cities as well. As a woman, I think you are conscious, and actually it's worldwide, I think you're conscious of your physical security in a way that maybe men are not in many instances. Pretty much, something as crude as having your bottom pinched is not something I worry about when I'm walking down the street. Or having, remarks made because my sleeve is too long, too short. So as a woman, I think women will have a different relationship to the city, but there is no one female relationship to the city either. It will vary depending on their class, depending on their own attitude of those who feel more vulnerable in the same situation versus those who somehow have a confidence to cope with that situation. So yeah, I think you will have a gender difference, but I don't think we should also make it that there's one male view versus one female view. There's a multiplicity of male views, female views, and now increasingly transgendered views.
Can I just quickly add that, I just said you facetiously asked me sounds and smells or whatever.
Yes.
And I made
it. I'm sorry, it was meant to be.
No, it's a light-hearted discussion. Yes. So I'm going to add something light-hearted, but also profoundly serious, which is that, in relation to that, I told you earlier that after the sanitized nature and prettiness of San Diego, I went to New York in 1979, and I was excited by things, by smells, which canonically would be deemed unpleasant.
Right.
And the other realm in which that happens is sex, where you are excited by shameful or unpleasant things in what in the outer world would be not nice.
Right.
In that private space, those are the very things that excite you.
Yes.
So there is a kind of relationship there.
Yeah.
It doesn't answer questions about gender.
Tell us more about you.
If I may quickly interject one point about this real and imagined also, I think I imagine that for the majority of citizens in most cities, and it's true of newcomers to New York as much as in Dhaka, this city is not something imagined, it's actually something very real, and their overwhelming preoccupation with the city may be the practical challenges of living in it. And the kind of talks we're talking about, whether it's imagined or not, they may see as the pastimes of the pampered. It's not something they even have time to think about. But on the other hand, I also don't want to be condescending and say that they don't have their imagined components. I think every individual who's engaging with a city, because cities are a great provocation. And just because somebody is poor or is really worried about where they can get some kind of relief next, that also doesn't mean that they don't have the imaginative faculty. They may have a more rich imagination than I do, and it would be interesting if we start hearing more about those voices and what those negotiations are from different vantage points.
So thank you. I've been reminded that we are out of time, and there's another panel that is going to be moving in here very shortly. So thank you very much, and thank you, panelists. Thank you. All right, we're done.